I'm here today with Dr. Kevin Blackburn, an associate professor in history at the National Institute of Education. He has recently published this very important book called The Comfort Women of Singapore in History and Memory. I'm here to ask him a couple of questions about this book. Thank you, Dr. Blackburn, for giving us this opportunity. We know there were a number of comfort stations in Singapore during the Japanese occupation period, but not many Singaporeans assumed that local women served in these stations. They usually assumed that most of the women came from Korea. Even in the 1990s, when many women in Korea started to speak out about their experiences as former comfort women, no one in Singapore has come forward as a former comfort woman. Your book analyzes both the history and memory of the comfort women in Singapore. Can you tell us what kind of testimonies and sources are available to unveil this part of history?
Yes, as historians, it's always difficult to document silences. And in this case, there is a great silence in Singapore history. So with the women, they have maintained a silence right until their graves. They decided to keep these stories private, so they never told them. In the 1990s, throughout Asia, many women from many different countries, the Philippines, Indonesia, as well as China, Taiwan, and Korea, even in Japan too, they were coming forth to tell their stories in order to seek compensation and justice. In the case of Singapore, the women decided to remain silent. They'd been silent all their lives, and they'd lived kind of comfortable lives in their families and their communities without their families knowing or their communities knowing. They decided to remain silent after the war because of the stigma that they would face if it became, well known that they'd been comfort women during the war. So we can't actually have their testimony. So what to do if you want to prove that these women existed? Because you have people who say, well, they don't exist because they didn't come forward. So you have to find eyewitness testimony that is not from these women. So we find that in the form of what their sister says, or what their cousin says, or what their close family friends and close neighbors will say about that one day when the Japanese military came into their village or came into their street and rounded up young women and took them into comfort stations, or raped them and took them into comfort stations. And this is eyewitness testimony. We also get men who actually recall this too, but mostly it's women who are close to the victim. Usually it's a case that they'll talk about this only because the female victim has passed away. They won't do it otherwise. So yeah, this is an important oral history source. It's something that we collect through interviews ourselves, but also we have corroboration through the testimony that we find in the National Archives oral history collection on the Japanese occupation. So there are other sources that corroborate this as well. When we look at the records of the memoirs of the Japanese veterans, often they mention when they're visiting comfort stations in Singapore and also in Malaysia too, that there are local women there actually, and they're quite enthusiastic about it actually, because one suspects that these women were brought in for reasons of sexual pleasure for the Japanese, because they comment upon Chinese women being there, Malay women being there, and Eurasian women, as well as even Indian women were there too actually. So this is from the testimony of memoirs. So this is from a period when it wasn't shameful to have visited these places before the controversy kind of erupted. So we can take it in that context actually. So yeah, because they're recalling this both in Malaysia and Singapore, because they share a common past, we can see that local women were definitely there, because the Japanese veterans do confirm it. And then there's also testimony in the form of a kind of diary that we have of the Cairn Hill Road Comfort Station. This was written by the Korean manager of it, and it's been quite a controversial source actually. So these kind of entries in the diary kind of give us some insight into the lives of the women as well as the operation of the comfort station. It kind of fills in the gap because we have Japanese military sources that tell us how these places were run and how they operated. One for Singapore, there's a well-known document for the Jalan Jurong Kirchul comfort station actually, and it mentions the times, it mentions the price, it mentions which units were to be served, but it doesn't tell us anything about the women themselves, whether they were Indonesians, whether they were Koreans, whether the local women, we just don't know. So the archival records have major limitations which are only kind of filled by the testimony of the women themselves. So in the case of Singapore, in terms of the local women, they're not going to say what it's like, of course, and then you get other women, and other people who had some knowledge of the comfort station who might have visited, but the key source is actually the experience of the Korean women. Okay, the Korean women, in terms of their oral history testimony, it's been magnificently stored and preserved by the Korean Council in Korea, actually. So this is a very good source as well. You've got women like Kim Bok-dong who have had their testimony preserved. She's an activist and she's given lots of interviews, but perhaps the longest one was the one that has been kind of kept by the Korean Council in Korea. So these tell us about the lives, the ordinary daily lives of the comfort women themselves, which we don't get from the military records in the archives. So without those records, we would have a very limited view about what it was like. We have some idea from some of the people who were Singaporeans who could look and see what happened. I described that in the book, people who lived next to a comfort station and what they described. But yeah, what the women felt and experienced, yes, in terms of Singapore, we have a number of Korean women who worked in Singapore, so this gives us a great insight into their daily lives.
How were they recruited or conscripted? And can we know how many local women were involved?
Yes, in the case of Singapore and much of Southeast Asia, abduction and rape was common. There were other ways that women were brought into the comfort women system, and these were what we would describe today as sexual human trafficking actually. Yeah, so these don't follow the pattern of kidnap and rape, which we do see it's common in Southeast Asia as a conquering army enters the region. Yeah, you have this. So with human trafficking, it relies upon deception. We see this a lot in Korea actually, and a lot of women describe how they thought they were coming to Singapore because there was a cleaning job or a nursing job or whatever. We also see Indonesian women coming to Singapore for similar reasons. So deception was used, and this is part of human trafficking actually. So in the case of Singapore, we start to see that the Japanese move into areas of Singapore like Chinatown, where there are large numbers of Chinese prostitutes, and these are women that range from so-called low class to the high class, which are more like the courtesans, because they provide a range of entertainment services like singing, musical instruments, clever conversation, as well as sex. So these are serving Chinese businessmen. So what the Japanese military does is they tend to use collaborators to actually get these women. And these women are kind of quite desirable from the perspectives of the officers who are used to something like this in the low-class geisha houses that they've come from. And also they're setting up those type of kind of restaurants, geisha houses already in Singapore. So what they do is they tend to use deception, and if that doesn't work, they'll use coercion. So in the case of the one that we do have oral history testimony from, Ho Kwai Min, she describes this process. She successfully resisted being brought into the comfort women system, but she paid a heavy price because the Japanese officers would still demand that she come and entertain them. So what she did when the day came when a Chinese trader as she calls him, came to her place in Chinatown, where her madam, who employed her, was. She tried to get out of this. The Chinese trader was with 2 Japanese soldiers, and he asked for Madam Ho, and he asked for another high-class prostitute, and Madam Ho said no, and then the Madam and Ho tried to persuade the Chinese trader and the Japanese soldiers to take someone else, which is what they suggested. Basically, they suggested, well, if you're not going to come, you will need 2 others. So they were able to persuade 2 so-called lower-class prostitutes. These are their terms, not mine. So these 2 women were sent instead. But also to seal the deal, basically they had to have sex with this Chinese trader and the Japanese officer, the Japanese soldiers, sorry. So these 2 women, basically were persuaded to go. I suppose they knew very well, what it meant. I suppose there must have been some pressure from the madam as the employer of both Madam Ho and also the 2 lower class prostitutes. So what happened was that, as Madam Ho says, she knows that these women were sent to a comfort station at a military base in Malaysia, and she recalls that there was an explosion there, and these women escaped, and they found their way back to Singapore eventually. So she must have had some knowledge about, them in order to know this. So this is kind of like a very different scenario from the women in the villages who are largely teenagers or very young women in their 20s being abducted and raped and forced to go into the comfort system in a very kind of brutal way. But it's still coercion, of course. And you have other cases too where these women who are known as sing-song girls, because they sing actually, like Madam Ho was one of these most popular ones. She was a kind of legend in that part of Chinatown for being a courtesan or a high-class prostitute. So she didn't play a musical instrument, but she sung. So they were called sing-song girls. So we know from oral history testimony from Malaysia that there were these sing-song girls that were sent to the Taiping comfort stations, and there were 20 of them. And in the same batch, there was coerced by the Japanese to come. And that batch was about 50. So the other 30 went to Thailand and 20 went to Taiping, where they served mainly the ordinary Japanese soldiers. So they were quite used to the long lines from Taiping actually, because they were serving ordinary soldiers in large numbers. So this was different from what they were doing in Singapore, of course, and that they often spoke to a vendor of cigarettes about their plight, and then after the war he gave an oral history account during the 1990s about these women. So that's a kind of eyewitness kind of account of their life and their recruitment. They all said that they were coerced, just as Madam Ho escaped being coerced, through persuading 2 others to take their place. These women were also sing-song girls from Chinatown, Cantonese, most of them were Cantonese. So, this is another way in which women were kind of enslaved, actually.
Do we know roughly how many?
Numbers are always difficult, actually, because, you figure that, that's 50 in one go. Maybe it could be large, but usually in terms of the numbers of women, usually we figure that it couldn't have been that large, that it's probably in the hundreds, from the witnesses' accounts. And when we hear people talk about the comfort stations in Singapore, we rarely hear people talk about Singapore women being noticeable in large numbers. So it's not like, say, Indonesia, where there are large numbers, Indonesian women are in large numbers there. So it's likely that the number couldn't have been in the thousands, but likely to have been in the hundreds, perhaps no more than 1,000. But the women are sent overseas, actually. They're sent to Thailand, they're sent to Malaysia, they're sent to Indonesia as well. So they do serve in local comfort stations. So one can only guess how many women there were, but it's likely that it was in the hundreds. Unlikely to be over 1,000, and certainly not in the thousands.
Can you tell us about what happened to these women after the Japanese were gone, and why did they become so silent about their experiences?
Yes, after the Japanese are gone, life doesn't really get much better for them. Many of these women know that if they go back to their families and their communities, they'll experience stigma, they'll be ostracized, they'll be shunned. And we know the ones that did, went through this process. Some had to leave, where they lived and move somewhere else because basically they were associated with prostitution, even though, of course, basically they were coerced into becoming the sex slaves of the Japanese. In the period soon after the war, basically they were just seen as tainted women, fallen women, these type of things. What happened was, of course, is that many of these women did stay in prostitution after the war. Look at the case of the Indonesians, actually, who came to Singapore. They, settled down here, actually. Some did go into prostitution, some went into nightclubs, others married Malay men here and settled down. When we look at the local women, we see that, a lot of them, according to colonial records, went into becoming streetwalkers along Jalan Besar. Okay, so, there are lots of reports about large numbers of women performing, sexual services and basically gathering men from Jalan Besar and moving into these cubicles where they'd give sexual services or provide sexual services. So this was quite out in the open. So the colonial authorities, who weren't very sympathetic to these women anyway, just wanted to basically get rid of this. And there were many people in the community, particularly male leaders, who weren't very sympathetic, and they wanted just to get rid of this as well. Even the military, the British military who came, they realised that this wasn't something that they wanted, and they blamed these women for the spread of venereal disease. So these women were rounded up and arrested. Gradually, they were removed from the public landscape. The ones that were under 18 were sent to a specially set up girls' school in Pasir Panjang, and this kind of followed the old practice of sending these women who were engaged in prostitution, who were underage, to a kind of home. But because of the involvement of a kind of early feminist, Lee Q, who was a former communist actually from the resistance movement, she was part of the council that was deciding the fate of these women. Basically, she suggested they be employed in factories as alternative employment, and then she said, well, maybe they should be taught skills. So they were taught skills in terms of homemaking skills, job skills. They were given a basic education. They seemed to have quite warmed to this, actually, because it meant that they could get employment, whereby, you didn't have, enslavement, it meant that they could marry. So many of them actually did, when they were 18, usually what would happen would be that they would kind of marry perhaps a working class Chinese man who couldn't afford to get a China bride because it cost so much. So they would kind of get a bride from the girls' training school, which was at Pasir Panjang. So basically the women themselves moved into society and basically were silent about what they'd been through, and it was quite clear that if they did discuss it, then they'd be ostracized again, just as they were ostracized just after the war. So basically they were silent in order to survive, actually, after the war, and they maintained that silence right until the very end. I'd say it's obvious now after so many years that many of these women have taken their story to the grave, actually. In the 1990s, the prospect of them demanding compensation and justice, which we saw in other countries, and them revealing their identities, was very slim that this prospect would occur. Even in Malaysia, actually, the women tended to obscure their identity. Only one, actually, Rosalind Saw, actually from Penang, ever revealed her full identity, actually, and it was quite a surprise to her children. It was quite a surprise to everyone, and she never achieved compensation or justice, actually, and passed away. So with Singapore women, it's interesting because they seem to have known that this was perhaps a viable path, in a sense. It's like in Japan, there was an early movement, or there was interest in this in the early 70s in the lives of comfort women, and one was quite well known, Kikimura, and she actually committed suicide trying to get compensation from the Japanese government or recognition. And her suicide letter was quite interesting, actually. One of my colleagues, who works on Japanese comfort women, she's got a book about this and an article. She describes the suicide note when she says that many of the other women who didn't come forward, they were much cleverer than I was, because when she came forward, she experienced all the horrors of ostracization and stigmatization, and none of the prospects of recognition or justice for her plight. So in the case of Singapore women, there are like many women who didn't come forward, actually. Many Japanese women didn't come forward, of course, very few, compared to the numbers. So with the local women, as I say in the book, basically, most comfort women who lived through this experience, even after the 1990s, remained silent, because of dominant patriarchal values in society, and the prospect of compensation and justice was so slim. But actually, when we look at the life of Rosalind Saw from Penang, that's exactly what she said, actually, is that she came forward to get compensation and justice because she'd seen all the newspaper articles in the Malaysian Star, and this is what maintained her strength, actually, through this period. But most women did not seem to make that decision. In the case of Singapore, it's similar to Vietnam, it's similar to Thailand, where you don't get women coming forward.
Is there anything that you want students to take away from discussion?
Okay, one of the most important parts of the research was actually students. And students should never underestimate the significance of what they're doing as students. And I'll tell you why. In the early 2000s, I commenced this mass oral history project with many of my students who were training to be teachers. And it didn't last very long as a mass project because of curriculum changes. But during that time, we had something like 500 students a year, only for a few years, going out, and doing oral history. So many of them uncovered not these women telling their story, but their sister, their cousin, their close neighbor who was willing to tell their story. And they were willing to talk about these women because many of them had passed on, actually. So through this, many students, as part of this big project that we had, were able to basically reinforce what, other testimony had told us too, and also what one had suspected, and many people had suspected, actually. Student research, student activities in history are always enlightening for the teachers, actually. It's always been an education to be educated by students about their own local history. So yes, I would never underestimate the value of what students do.
Thank you so much for sharing your research and thoughts today.
Okay, thank you very much for having me.